They say a crisis reveals more than it conceals, and we are witnessing that play itself out in the franchising sector at the moment, with weaknesses inherent in franchise businesses and the health of relationships between franchisors and franchisees being exposed as the COVID-19 pandemic has unfolded throughout the year. Take famous brands, for example, the poor performance of Gourmet Burger Kitchen and the inability of famous brands to steer the UK business back to profitability has certainly been a worrying factor for investors. It was once the doyen of the franchise sector. I think Famous Brands has much to do to regain its reputation. There's been an excessive reliance on retail infrastructure, perhaps insufficient investment in digital technology and poor delivery capability, and that has impacted franchise networks. In contrast, more agile franchise businesses are riding the crest of the COVID-19 wave by providing services that drive change consumer behavior. Except for franchisors with a very large number of franchisees, I think the failure of one or a few franchisees may have an important long-term impact on an entire franchise network, including on its reputation and its credibility, certainly in its markets and with its customers, suppliers and partners. It may also constitute a significant impediment to any future development of the franchise network. Given this reality, currently for some and foreseeable for many, what should a franchisor and a franchisee do in this environment? To talk about the good, the bad and the ugly impacts of COVID-19 on the sector, I'm joined now by Bendita Gordon, specialist in the franchise sector and author of The Franchise Factor, Tony De Fonseca, who's the immediate past chairman of FASA, the Franchising Association of South Africa, and now currently MD of OBC Group, and Nicole Gundelfinger, Group Marketing Manager of Cash Converters. Tony, the franchise sector at the end of last year was really holding its own in what was a very difficult economic environment. If you look at FASA's franchise survey of last year, the sector contributed almost 740 billion rand in turnover. That's equivalent to almost 14% of the country's GDP. 800 franchise systems, close to 48,000 franchise outlets, and a workforce of close to 500,000. So a very important sector. Let's just go back to the beginning of the crisis, because we did talk about this in July. What impact has COVID had on that picture so far?
Well, I've always been a great advocate for franchising, and if it's done right, it's the best way to empower people. But of course, as I've often said, that the franchising is not immune to the economy. So who could have foreseen an epidemic like this that would literally close down our economy? So I don't think whether it's franchise or whether it's independent business, it really depends on the business model. Business that were in retail thrived actually during this process in essential services, because although they had to put up a lot of regulation and what have you, they were fortunate enough to trade. But whether it's independent restaurants or independent or chains, when you're not allowed to trade, you're not allowed to trade, and that really is, as I say, it's no business is immune to an economy. And although franchising did hold out well in a very poor economy of the last 10 years and actually grew, it shows the strength of the model done right that can grow in tough times. And that's really the strength in the collective, where people can market together and buy together, and the model really works. But unfortunately, in circumstances like this, if businesses weren't allowed to trade, then it's not a reflection, I'd like to believe, it's not a reflection on the franchising industry as such. And the best thing that people can do is really just obviously keep the collective and obviously market harder and fight harder for their market share. But it has changed our business model. I think a lot of the feedback we're getting, especially in the QSR environment, is that more people are rather taking deliveries. So it has changed the model a bit, and it's put pressure. I mean, especially with the restaurants, with people ordering in. Obviously, the liquor component, where restaurants tend to make a bit more profit, is probably not taking off. And just talking to some of the guys in the trade, they've said that consumers are coming in and not having a starter, asking for a glass of water and not a bottle of water, and at the end of the day, not having dessert. So the pockets are tight. So I still believe that franchising has got the best chance to survive this and grow, actually. And as I say, the tough economy that we've all faced through this epidemic shouldn't be a reflection on franchising. It's really the economy itself that's taken a knock. And like I say, we're not immune to what's happening in our economy.
There's lots of interesting points to unpack there around the impact on the individual brands as they hand over a lot of their distribution to third parties and what impact that might have. But Bendita, as an opening comment, what do you see as some of the weaknesses potentially in the model that were exposed by COVID-19? Because it is a model, if you look at the balance sheet, that is highly levered and that is paid down through future cash flows, which are usually quite predictable. Then you have a pandemic that shuts down your cash flow. Not many people could have predicted that, but it's put a lot of strain on the model.
Michael, I specifically wanted to look at QSR and restaurants. I think those two business categories were the ones that were most severely hit during the lockdown period. So what was very, very surprising to me, particularly in the early stages when these businesses weren't allowed to trade, was that it was very, very quiet. And if you look at quick service restaurants, they're represented as listed companies in the JSE, famous brands. Spur would fit more into the restaurant category. And it was, again, very surprising that we didn't hear from these big brands who we all look up to as to what it is that they're doing. And when we assess a particular franchise, not the industry as a whole, but a particular franchise, when this kind of force majeure happens, we look at three particular aspects. Number one, the incisiveness of leadership. You know, what is that strategic edge that leaders are taking their group through? Number two, we would look at management dexterity. You know, franchisors would be captaining a vast amount of people, franchisees who've invested their life savings, franchisee staff who are probably the most vulnerable of all parties in the franchise relationship. And how are they, you know, essentially imbuing confidence in that they know where they're going to take the brand forward, how they're going to deal with a very intensive care situation. And thirdly, what relates to both the franchisor and the franchisee is liquidity. What, you know, in very highly geared situations, franchisees are in trouble and so are franchisors. So, you know, we would have the Restaurant Association of South Africa really staging a protest and you know, widely marketed by the media or exposed by the media, and you're only seeing independents. You're not seeing franchisors. You're not seeing franchise associations. And that concerned me greatly. The only franchise that really stood out and said, this is what we think, was McDonald's, who said, you know, our drive-thrus are going to work perfectly from a PPE, safety, sanitized perspective, but everybody else, in fact, surprised me. I mean, Spur came out with, I think there were 2 or 3 senior people in the organization that resigned. And that is really a slap in the face in terms of franchisees, because sure, you've got Pierre van Tonder, people who are we highly respect in the franchise community, in probably franchisees' worst period that they've experienced, they're going. Now, who's news that's coming, and what are we going to do? And it was really a big surprise.
On that point, I just want to bounce that back to you, Tony, because as a former past chairman of the Franchising Association of South Africa, on the first point of lobbying, could FASA have done a little bit more? I did see Wendy Alberts all over the place going out to bat for the independent restaurants. And secondly, I was surprised when I interviewed Pierre van Tonder about the timing of his resignation. I questioned him and said, obviously this was a long time in the making, but then this once-in-a-generation crisis happens. Didn't you think about just delaying it out by a year and riding through the storm? And he just batted it away. He didn't see an issue at all, which I felt was a little tone deaf.
Yeah, I think with times being this hard, I think most CEOs wanted to resign at some point in having to face this. But jokes aside, I think there was, I mean, both through FASA and through the Consumer Goods Council, there was extensive lobbying done directly with Minister Patel himself. And I was on a number of forums. Certainly I can talk about for our brand. I don't necessarily want to talk for other brands. But wearing a FASA hat, a Consumer Goods Council hat, and an OBC hat, we had extensive workshops with the minister, advising on what we should be doing, how we should be doing it, and as an industry. And there was CEOs of some of the brands that were mentioned on that same forum who were doing their utmost to try and get the powers that be to just change legislation a bit quicker. I remember having a one-on-one engagement with Minister Patel itself when he was asking us in the retail environment to put our staff on shifts. I said to him, how is that going to be possible? Because you got all of us on a curfew. So how are we going to put our staff on? And then that changed. So I think a lot of the efforts weren't as in the public eye as some of the other associations had done physical demonstrations. But certainly from FASA side and from Consumer Goods Council, there was extensive lobbying directly to the ministry and directly to the people who could make a decision. Did it always work? Could we always do more? Absolutely. There's no track record of what could have been done better. Just making your voice heard in terms of representing your members and in this case, representing our own brands. And certainly both FASA and Consumer Goods Council did get the CEOs to actually engage one-on-one with Minister Patel on more than one occasion. And recently, not more than 2 weeks ago, there was more engagement about how we can change things. So yeah, unfortunately, not everything is in the public eye. Not all of those engagements and lobbying that happened through the associations actually became apparent, but they did have an influence, albeit not as fast as what we'd like, but they did have a contribution to changing some of the regulations through the pandemic. As for Pierre, as I say, I can't comment. I know Pierre for many years, and I know that he was planning to resign. Yeah, it's a tough one. The timing was not ideal. But like I say, I don't want to comment on that because I know from his own reasons that he was planning to resign. Possibly from a brand perspective, they could have delayed it a bit. But like I say, it's tough times. I don't want to judge anyone or comment on their actions. It is a tough time for most companies out there.
Nicole, how important is that continuity in leadership at a franchisor level for franchisees through a crisis like this?
I think it's absolutely critical. To pick on what Bendita and Tony have both said, fantastic points, and it was definitely a strength in our brand. We had 9 people around the exco table, very clearly charting a course. Obviously, looking back, hindsight's 2020. There's certain things we would have done differently, but the drive was to get our stores trading and open as much as possible, get cash flow moving through the business. And to Bendita's point, you've got people who've invested everything into this venture. We had a store that opened on the 1st of March. I don't think he could have picked a worse time to start trading. Having said which, 6 months later, he turned a profit last month. So I think that does speak to the strength of the franchising sector. We had a very clear strategy, very clear strategic direction. Our C-suite have been in this business for 26 years. And I think that laid a really solid foundation to make sure that our franchisees knew all they needed to do was get up, go to their store, we'll interpret the legislation, we'll speak to the minister and the NCR on your behalf, just keep trading. So I think for our network, particularly with 3 different business units under one brand, that was a massive strength for our franchise network.
And Nicole, looking at the Cash Converters business model, it certainly plays to your strengths, an environment where consumers are under a little bit of pressure, but also are mulling about the home because you're in lockdown and finding items that potentially you want to liquidate. What impact has the crisis had on the brand?
So we have always thought we've got a great business model. You know, we've got 3 different businesses under one. So when one's up, the other one's generally down. The pandemic, for us, the silver lining has been that it really just highlights the strength of this particular business model. We are incredibly lucky that we've made quite a big move towards digitization of the business in the last 5 years. Richard, our CEO, likes to say it's really good management, but it was actually just really good timing that we were positioned for that. Our retail has been through the roof. I think people are very, very conscious of what money has been spent on. To Tony's point, you really think twice about what you're going to spend. Our retail is 100% of the utility at half the price. So keeping stock on the retail floor to sell on to consumers has been a huge challenge, which is a really good problem to have in such a tight environment. There's been a lot more consumer liquidity, so it's taken a little bit longer for our loan books to recover, but as the markets have opened, as the various levels of lockdown have started to ease, we have seen that pick up again. And I think to speak to the good of franchising, retail was up supporting the downs on the loans book. We do secured and unsecured money lending. And that kept a lot of our franchisees liquid. We talked about liquidity a few minutes ago. Cash flow is absolutely king. Without the money from retail coming in, it's a little bit difficult to pay your rent, keep the lights on, and pay your staff. And I agree with Bendita, staff are critical to the success of any business, and definitely the most vulnerable in this very delicate ecosystem.
I want to come back to the issue of liquidity, Tony, and it's a good point that Bendita raised as well. The fact that it's a model that in the past has been highly levered because the cash flows have been forecastable. A pandemic would no doubt upend that. And the big question is what happens if we go into next year and see a potential lockdown again going into winter. The virus does seem to have a high seasonal impact and effect, and even the most optimistic forecaster that we'll only see a vaccine, according to Pfizer, towards the back end of next year. So what does this mean for the business model over the next 12 to 24 months?
I think certainly Bendita made a very good point in terms of a lot of the models, a lot of the franchisors, possibly through tough trading, or due to those reasons, they've allowed stores to open that are highly geared. And it's sort of an unwritten rule in franchising that at least 50% of your capital should be unencumbered. We certainly try to stick to that because at the end of the day, even through better times, that's the way you gear a business effectively. And you're not highly geared and paying a lot of interest in your cash flows under pressure all the time. Again, it depends on the business model. From our side, I still think it's a very good principle that is at least 40. Some of the banks even insist on up to 60% unencumbered. Again, depending on the model. But I would warn against these unpredictable times. I would warn against going into businesses where your cash is stretched to the ultimate, because one bump in the economy, and I think we're going to have a lot of bumps going forward, will derail that business and will set you up for disaster. So possibly get into a smaller business where you're better geared, and something that sort of appeals to the broader market nowadays under cash constrained environment. Businesses that have thrived. In our case, we're in basic food business. In Nicole's case herself, that business does appeal where people are being more prudent with their money. And we found that we're starting to attract customers of what was a higher income level coming into our stores and finding that they're getting great quality at better prices in the market that we traditionally served. So we also see ourselves opening up stores in slightly higher income markets because we're getting requests from consumers that would traditionally shop in a higher LSM environment.
Which just goes to show there is always opportunity. And added to that, we've got the MPC meeting again next week. We see interest rates at multi-decade lows. That does mean for the model, the cost of capital has come down a little bit, Bendita. Where do you see opportunities in this environment?
Well, I think there are opportunities internal, so to speak, to franchisors in terms of negotiating as a group with landlords and getting rentals down. I think, the model surely now is showing cracks in it, if the business models themselves. So franchisors need to identify where those cracks are and work on it more cohesively with all their franchisees, sharpen the pencil in terms of marketing. Digitization is a huge, huge opportunity now, and it's been very, very poorly implemented. I am a critic, and I think if we're not going to see businesses very, very clear on that, on the digitization and how consumers' behavior is changing. I mean, just to use an example, Mr. D is and Uber Eats are paving the way forward for delivery of fast food. And I think it's taken very, very well-known brands that in fact positioned their businesses on delivery, like Debonair's, Nando's, they all have delivery, but consumers are veering towards Mr. D and Uber Eats. Mr. D is aggressively going on a media campaign on TV. So those are the kind of internal to franchising opportunities that I see. External, I think they absolutely abound. Businesses, non-franchise businesses I'm talking about, large businesses need to reduce costs. So there's certain services that they can, shared services within groups that can be outsourced, bookkeeping, payroll management, human resources, accounting management. These type of shared services can be outsourced, and I am seeing that there are going to be professionals coming out of businesses that are retrenching, looking for opportunities. So franchisors that can provide those type of homes for these professionals will have an abundance of potential franchisees. And then I just, I was reading about Joburg City Council's billing system yesterday.
Oh.
And, those of us that have franchising running in our blood, whenever we see something, we think about, wow, franchising could sort this problem out. And in fact, in the Joburg billing system, you could franchise various departments or franchise various areas to very good credit controllers and bookkeepers, and remunerate them based on their performance, utilizing the central services of Joburg City. So I think councils and I think government and I think some very smart hats need to be put on and said, how are we going to make our economy better? Because we're in a very, very difficult situation.
At a time when public-private partnerships are all the buzzword, maybe we could also franchise out the maintenance of the city's road infrastructure as well, which is just holes. That's what we seem to produce more than anything around the city of Johannesburg. But on that point, Nicole, the opportunities for your business right now, what are you focused on as a team?
Definitely digitization. We need to hope and pray we don't have a second and third wave, but history tells us we're very likely to. We need to be 100% prepared for the next wave. We were probably 80% there first time round. Second time round, we need to be able to transact completely online. We need customers to be able to buy and sell to us in a purely digital space. To speak to Bendita, 100% in terms of couriers and how would we get stock to and from homes and the stores. Big drive for us ahead of winter next year. And then money lending. We have the ability to transact unsecured offline and outside the store. We need to be ready to transact with our secured money lending product outside the environs of the store. Again, speaking to the fact that bricks and mortar, the landlords haven't been as forgiving as we'd hoped and expected. We've spent quite a bit of time negotiating and really trying to make good deals for both parties in all of that. But worst case scenario, yeah, when liquidity is down, we need to know that we can carry on transacting and pay those bills every month.
Oh, interesting point that you raised. I want to stay on that for a second longer. One would expect in an environment like this, you walk through the local strip mall, the big regionals, there are shuttered shops all over the place. One would imagine that that puts the power of negotiating for future leases in the hands of the tenants, not in the hands of the landlords. There's excess capacity in the market. Do you think that that's going to fundamentally shift and alter the dynamic into the future?
I see it from their perspective, from a landlord perspective. If you kind of bottom out your rental, you're starting at the bottom of a hill again to get that income up. Having said which, there is huge capacity out there, which is an opportunity for other businesses, other franchise outlets. It's fantastic for new tenants coming in. And not to say that some of the landlords haven't been superb, good, bad, and ugly across the board. I think if we were going to see such a big shift in terms of that power dynamic, it would have happened by now. But maybe 2021 will show a different side to that dynamic.
On that point, we've got 2 minutes left, Tony. We're looking out into 2021. How do you see things playing out in the franchise sector, broadly speaking? And just to hone in on one issue that Bendita mentioned, I think it's a very important one. The fact that brands have outsourced their last mile to a large extent to the likes of a Mr. D or an Uber Eats. And what impact might that have on their brand strength in the future as consumers now go through one portal? Surely that dilutes the power of that brand over time.
Yeah, it certainly does, and also introduces other dynamics, because obviously you outsource your last mile, as you say, but sometimes the last mile, I've personally experienced deliveries being done in unregistered motorbikes. The lights don't work, the flickers don't work, they won't let them into the estate, and so on. So it is risks on the brand side, yeah. or your food arrives cold, or it's been turned upside down, so your salad is a proper salad now, or your pizza's now not the way it should be. So that is a risk to, and the likes of Mr. D and Uber need to focus on that. But I think it also does create opportunities where it's going to put pressure more on landlords as well, because there's already talk among some brands of going into more of a dark kitchen environment, where they don't need stores where there's a lot of footfall, because they can predominantly focus their business on delivery. So why have a shop front when you can operate from a warehouse? And I've even seen brands talking and collaborating on having joint kitchens as a dark kitchen. So you might find your pizza, your burger, and your fish, etc., is coming out of the same kitchen, but being delivered in a different brand. So brands are starting to be more creative in the way they do it.
On that point, Tony, I've got to stop you because we have run out of time. But when I think of joint kitchens, I think of another opportunity in the green economy as well, and that's certainly opening up with current legislation before Parliament. And that was Tony de Fonseca, who's the previous past chairman of the Franchising Association of South Africa and MD of the OBC Group, talking about franchising around the table with Bendita Gordon, a specialist in the franchise sector and author of The Franchise Factor, and Nicole Gundelfinger, who is a group marketing manager of Cash Converters.